Hi everyone, I'm live now doing a new kind of stream that I've never done before. This is actually technically a guest lecture. Hi everyone, I'm live now doing...
Oh no, hold on, let me mute the, sorry. That's totally my fault. Okay.
Yeah, so it's a guest lecture for the EVOS seminar series through Binghamton University. And the lecture title is Radical Trans Biology, which was suggested to me by Maximus, and I thought it sounded cool, so that's what it's going to be called. Maximus, do you want to introduce the seminar series or say a little?
Yeah. So my department at Binghamton is the Evolutionary Studies Department, EVOS, and so we've been running this seminar series for a while, and basically the idea is to bring in guest lecturers from a lot of different disciplines that can try to give an evolutionary perspective on certain issues. And I'm super excited to be here with ContraPoints because I think that your perspective is very critical because there's just a lot of confusion about the relationship between biology and culture, and that's something that my lab tries to clarify in many ways. And the radical bit, because we need more radical bits. Yeah, so in this stream are myself and my co-teacher Mel and the students, and we'll just Contra will give the lecture, and then we'll just have a nice chat about it. And I think that's all that needs to be said right now.
Okay, do we want to do quick introductions?
Yeah.
I guess I will start. My name is Natalie, which is probably what you should call me instead of Professor ContraPoints, which is awkward, and I'm also not a real professor. So I'm a YouTuber, but I do have some kind of vague qualification in that I have a background in academic philosophy. So I have a master's in philosophy from Northwestern. I TA'd some classes there. I TA'd a class on Foucault, some intro classes. I taught a class a couple years ago on Wittgenstein, but since then, I haven't done anything with academia. I'm just a professional talking on YouTube person. I'm also a transgender woman, so that is kind of relevant to the discussion at hand, which is about being transgender in biology, or about biological sex. And I guess I want to say at the beginning that I have been medically transitioning for about 4.5 months, but I've done no medical, I have no academic research or anything on transsexuality or being transgender. So I shouldn't be considered an expert on that just because I'm trans, but what I want to do is it's obviously something I think about a lot, and I want to kind of apply my sort of philosophical background to try to understand some of the science that's been done so far on being transgender, and also on just how to conceptually think about this phenomenon, I guess, in terms of biological sex and what it means for our way of thinking about biological sex. So that's, I guess, enough out of me. Everyone else want to say hi and just give us a sentence or two about your academic interests or whatever other interests?
Maybe Mel, you could start.
Hi, I'm Mel. I'm helping Maximus to facilitate the EVOS seminar series, and I'm really fascinated with humans and human minds and how they evolved and how they got to be the way that they are and produce culture. So that's why I'm in this, and I also, along with Maximus, really want people to get more involved in evolutionary thinking.
Cool.
I think I'll just call on people to keep things going. So, Yuang, you want to go?
Who, me?
Yes.
Okay, hi, I'm No Wong. I'm studying biology at Binghamton, and I've mostly focused on the genetics side of biology, so I'm interested to see the anthropological side of this topic. So interested to see what you have to say. Yeah.
Cool. Richard, can you go next?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Richard. I'm also a senior at Binghamton University, and I'm studying biology. I'm kind of interested in marine biology, and yeah, basically that's it. Yeah.
Victoria?
Hi, I'm Victoria. I'm also a biology major at Binghamton, but a little bit different. I'm more interested in animals. I want to be a veterinarian, but I've always kind of been interested in evolution. I guess more so like animal evolution, but I mean, technically humans are animals, and I think it's pretty interesting how we kind of develop our own social constructs and things of that nature. So I'm pretty excited to learn more about evolution in this course.
Great. And Melvina?
Hi, I'm Melvina. I'm also a biology major. I took this class because I want to expand my knowledge on evolution and the evolutionary theory. That's basically it.
Great.
Cool. Okay, so I forgot that I'm doing the first lecture in this series. I'll try to get things started on a exciting note. Yeah, you guys are all bio people, so you probably know more bio than I do, but just correct me if I'm wrong about things. So I'll go ahead and get started with just saying words out of my mouth, but if you, oh, we got a new person.
We have one more person. Elmo, would you care to introduce yourself very briefly? Maybe not. What?
So yeah, I'm gonna just start going through PowerPoint slides and lecturing, but honestly, just if you have questions, ask a question or interrupt me or object or whatever, that's fine. So let's see, make sure I can work the internet here. Slides. Okay.
Yeah, I see it.
Cutesy little intro, okay. Okay, so the big questions basically that I want to hold in the background are, oh, I didn't want to make them smaller. Okay, yeah. So what is biological sex in the broadest sense, and what is gender? So what are we even talking about when we're talking about sex and gender? And what does it mean to be a man or a woman? So these are three different questions. What is biological sex? Seems like a biological question. What is gender? What does it mean? Seems like a kind of sociological question maybe. And what does it mean to be a man or a woman? That's like a philosophical, meaning of life kind of question, the way I look at it. So I guess what I want to do is start out, before we get into more sciencey things, just with a kind of philosophical preamble about just how to think about these kinds of questions and how to start even, how do you start even answering something like this? So I guess to begin with, when you do science, you kind of have to decide before you can do any observations or experiments, you have to kind of know a little bit in your head, at least, about what is the thing that you are observing. So you have to have a kind of conceptual framework, right, or theory before you can start collecting data. So I want to say that there's two basic kinds of question that you could ask in science. One is empirical questions, so questions that can be answered just by data, by collecting information, by doing experiments that you can, so for instance, does a new vaccine work effectively? That's an empirical question. You can't answer it by sitting in, by philosophizing, you have to do an experiment and find out. A conceptual question, I think, is well, my examples are what is gender, I think, or what is biological sex. Basically, any question that has the what is form involves a kind of decision about, it's sort of, you can't necessarily answer that question by poking around in the world. You can find out more information about a thing. You can find out sort of the adjectives of a thing, but you can't find out the noun, what the noun is, until you've sort of decided on that. So I guess what I'm suggesting here is that when you ask a big question like, what is biological sex, that's the kind of question that you might want to inform your answer with empirical evidence. Of course you will want to do that, but the question itself can't be answered just by that. You have to sort of think about it. So the question is, what kind of methodology could you even use to think about something like this? And I think when it comes to a lot of these topics, and especially when it comes to gender, the kind of default way that humans think about these things is called essentialism. So essentialism would basically be the idea that concepts, like the concept of man or the concept of woman, for example, correspond to some essence. So according to this way of thinking, an essence is a category clearly delineated by necessary and sufficient conditions. So actually, that's actually just one way to think about essences. So in philosophy, there's kind of like different ways to approach this. So in ancient Greek philosophy, for example, like Plato had a theory of essences, essentially that it's called the theory of forms, which is like metaphysically weird, but basically it says that for every type of thing, there's a perfect instance of that thing, and all examples of that thing are sort of lesser versions of that perfect form. So he was thinking really of geometry. So the idea was that like if you have a triangle, every actual shitty triangle that you draw is just like a kind of bad version of the perfect triangle, like the perfect conceptual triangle. And this is like a weird thing that's hard to think about if you're a scientist, because this is not how anyone thinks today. But Aristotle, his successor, has a much more kind of science-friendly way of thinking about it, which is that you can think of a category as defined or bounded by necessary and sufficient conditions. So what is a necessary or sufficient condition? Well, suppose depends what your question is. Suppose your question is, what is a chair, for example? So a necessary condition, you might say, something that nothing that doesn't have this is a chair. So you might want to say you can sit on it, right? That's a necessary condition for being a chair. A sufficient condition, I don't know if there's a sufficient condition for being a chair, but basically a sufficient condition means anything that has that quality belongs to the category. So I think probably a lot of people, a simplistic view of what a man is might be that a man is an adult human male. And all of those are, I guess, necessary conditions. If you're not human, you're not a man. If you're not male, you're not a man. If you're not an adult, you're not a man. But of course, what I'm going to want to problematize a little bit is the male part of this, which, I mean, the adult part is actually also complicated, and the human part, if you think about it, if you think about anything too much, it gets complicated. Like, what does it mean to be human, man? Like, I don't know. But basically, I want to suggest that there's a problem with essentialist thinking, especially when it comes to this kind of topic. And that problem is that reality doesn't work the way human psychology works a lot of the time. So we perceive, for example, discrete categories of color a lot of the time, which sort of correspond to the limits of our vocabulary. So different people are going to look at this rainbow spectrum and probably divide it up different ways based on how many words they know. So where do you draw the line separating red and pink, pink and blue, blue and light blue and green, green and yellow? I mean, it's kind of an arbitrary issue of setting boundaries, because all nature is providing you is a spectrum of light frequency. So in order to decide on fixed categories, I mean, why do you decide on fixed categories in the first place? Basically, because that's how human language works, right? If you have a word for something, then that word, our languages don't pick out like a million little gradations between red and pink, because that's not useful. What we pick out is like the bigger categories, which involves sort of making an arbitrary decision between this is where red ends, this is where pink begins. And this is kind of the physics example of color is a really obvious, I guess, and straightforward example of this, because it's clear to anyone who understands the basics of the physics of light that color is kind of the human psychological addition to a thing that's a continuum in nature. There are sort of, in biology, I think, less clear-cut examples. So one example we could give of a kind of sort of spectrum or continuum would be the sort of what I'll call the boy-man continuum. So there's not, we know that a 30-year-old person could be called a man, and a 12-year-old person would be called a boy. But there's not, and so clearly boys become men most of the time, but there's not going to be one day, right, where a boy becomes a man, right? You're just 12 years old in one day, 12 years old in 2 days, and then somewhere between the ages of, oh, I don't know, 13 and 20, you stop being a boy and start being a man. But I don't think, in terms of biology, you could say that there's a day when it happens. It just kind of, by little gradations, you get from one to the other. Which, and we don't like thinking about things this way, which might be why a lot of cultures kind of decide at a time when, okay, this is it, this is when it happens, right? So there's a lot of cultures have rituals where it's decided that a boy becomes a man or a girl becomes a woman, and partially that seems to be sort of like keep the categories coherent, right? Let's make a strong dividing line between boy and man, or between girl and woman, and that way we sort of know where socially people stand. We don't have this ambiguous area, which of course biologically is something that exists. Other example would be from evolution. So this is of all people a Richard Dawkins example, but the example is that you imagine a rabbit, a modern rabbit, and you imagine the rabbit's mother, and you imagine that mother's mother, and you just keep going back and back and back through generations until you get to like a common ancestor of the rabbit and the dog or something. And so the thought is that there's no moment where the non-rabbit mother gives birth to a rabbit, right? It's just gradations, things becoming slightly more rabbit-like each generation. Well, it's messier than that, of course, but that's how you would think of it if you drew out this long line of ancestry. And again, this is a kind of counterintuitive thought, which is why evolution is a difficult concept to explain to a lot of people, I think, because there's this people thinking we don't have a good psychological ability to think through however many tens of thousands of years of evolutionary time. So people have a hard time imagining how could a common ancestor of a chimpanzee and a human possibly through genetic inheritance become human. And that's partially a matter of our being unable to think of time, but it's also partially a matter of just the essentialist thinking that leads us to think that either you're human or you're not, and that there must be there can't be anything that's like sort of human or anything like that. We don't like the thought. So that, I think, is a reason why the necessary and sufficient conditions way is a little bit it's not always a great way to think about biological categories, because there's going to be more ambiguity than the idea of setting up necessary and sufficient conditions would usually suggest. So to take the chair example again, oh, actually, hang on, let me just plug in my computer here. To take the chair example again, our necessary and sufficient conditions might be that a chair is man-made, that it has a backrest, because a stool doesn't count as a chair, I guess, and that it's something that people sit on. But you could start problematizing these categories by pointing out other ways that we use the word chair to refer, for instance, to a naturally occurring chair-shaped rock that people sit on. That seems kind of like a chair, but it's not man-made. Or what about a giant sculpture of a chair that someone makes for artistic reasons and that no one sits on? So that's, it's man-made, it has a backrest, but no one sits on it. So these necessary and sufficient conditions, there's something artificial about them, I guess, is what I'm suggesting. It's that it might be useful to decide, I don't know why you would need to decide this, but if you need to be like, okay, for this particular project we have in mind, we definitely need to decide, we just need to make up boundaries for chairs, so we have a way of deciding what is a chair and what isn't. And in science, you end up doing this when you have an operational definition of something. So for example, psychologists or neuroscientists, suppose they're going to do a study about love. So love is like a huge, gigantic concept, like filled with like deep, like literary and spiritual significance. And a neuroscientist wants to look at what people in love, what the neurological sort of correlates of that are. Well, they're just going to have to say, okay, for the sake of this experiment, love is whatever is going on in your brain when you're looking at a picture of someone you love versus someone you don't. Obviously, that's going to be a reduction of what the concept of love is. I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. Of course, you kind of need to do it sometimes, but it's not a sort of natural thing. It's not the way we usually use language.
Natalie, can I bookmark something here for later? Hello?
Hello?
Yeah. I don't wanna take you away from your flow of thought too much, but what keeps on popping into my mind here is that typically the way that biologists like to define concepts is functionally, right? Which maybe has its own problems, this obsession with everything being adaptive and having a function, and maybe some things don't. But that's definitely where my mind wants to go, is asking questions along the lines of what is the function of gender in human society? What does it do? But
in society or in like biology?
Well, both.
Yeah.
But really looking at an adaptation of like what there's a thing in the world, and ultimately it has to lead back to the continuation of life in some way. Maybe it's social life, maybe it's physical life, but I have a bias to look for adaptive functions in explanations of living things, which may not be good, but
well, Maximus, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
But so the functional definitions run into a lot of trouble in evolutionary biology in general. I mean, that's the whole like teleosemantics thing. How do we functionally define something? There's a huge body of literature on that, but it's a lot harder when it comes to culture. So when we have cultural products, I mean, there really is no objective way of defining function or fitness with a cultural entity.
Yeah.
Yeah, the functionalist thing, like, it's been a while since I've thought about this. I mean, I agree that's a more like contemporary, like philosophy of science way of thinking about things. The necessary and sufficient conditions is like Aristotle shit. So like, that's not like, sorry, I should probably not be cursing, but like,
you can curse all you want.
The Aristotle thing, yeah, obviously this is not like really how contemporary scientists or philosophers think. But I think it's kind of how like, I guess I'm getting into this not necessarily through like a biological approach, but through like I don't know, like vulgar approach. Like, what does like the average person think about gender? I don't think the average person is thinking in terms of functionalism. I think they're thinking in terms of fixed category. At least that's my experience. Just like trying to talk to people about this, is that they are really like all their intuitions are essentialist. So you all, I understand, are like scientists and are not. Maybe for thinking about this and this, you've already trained your minds to do something different.
Maybe, but no, I think you're right. I think that we have essentialist intuitions because that's the way that our minds like to work, and we have to do work to get around that.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is, it's kind of why Wittgensteinian family resemblance, as opposed to like essentialist thought or bright line distinctions, has so much popularity in the philosophy of biology, because the Wittgenstein's family resemblance allows you to get at a lot of kind of like a network of different properties to define your categories.
We're like one slide away from that.
Okay.
Sorry.
Well, yeah. So that's great. Let's go back to that.
I completely agree with that. All right, I'll go back. There we go. Okay, so yeah. Yeah, so family resemblance. I'm going to skip prototypes because I don't think we need to. But basically, the prototype idea I want to suggest is like another way that people think about concepts that's not necessary and sufficient conditions, but also is not the Wittgenstein family resemblance thing. The prototype idea is kind of the Plato idea, but with like less metaphysically spooky. So the prototype idea is that basically the way a concept works, the way human concepts work, is that you have a kind of like ideal form of a thing in your mind. So I think this is psychologically accurate a lot of the time. Like when you're thinking, what is a chair? Like a picture a chair in your head. You're probably not picturing a folding beach chair or like a piano bench. You're imagining like a chair with 4 legs and a backrest. That's the kind of prototype of a chair. And then we sort of categorize things as chairs based on how much they resemble that prototype. Then the third way, okay, this is what we're getting to, yes. So the third way is the family resemblance thought. So this idea
Boring
is,
dead people.
yes, is the result of a boring dead person named Wittgenstein. And he, in the philosophical investigations, proposes family resemblance idea of understanding concepts, which basically is the idea that the way concepts work, or the way language works, basically, is that you're looking for, Wittgenstein's example is games. You're looking for what is it that unites, what is it that makes things games? Like, how do we set the boundaries of the category games? And he thinks of like, chess versus Ring Around the Rosie versus like, oh, I don't know, you could say like Jeopardy or something. Like these are all like games, but they seem not to have like, there's no like one thing that seems to be in common. Like you could say that, and the first thing I want to propose is that like a game is fun. Well, it's probably not fun a lot of the time when like professional football players are doing it. Like that's their job. They're not doing it for fun. So I think it's still a game. You could say that there's rules. Well, what about like, again, like, are there rules to Ring Around the Rosie? I guess kind of, or Calvin ball. I don't know. But you basically the thought, the image that he uses is that a concept is like, not like there's no common thread, is what he says. There's no common thread that unites all the things that are games. Instead, it's like a rope, and that there's like little threads that connect sort of certain members of the category, but there's no one that goes through the whole rope. So there's no one attribute that's going to unite the concept. So don't look for any one single thing. And he's also pairing this idea, he's getting it from what people who study Wittgenstein call the use theory of meaning, which is his idea that the way to understand, the way to answer basically what is questions. So what, he starts out with more simple stuff like what is, well, he's looking at like things like how do we use words like nouns versus adjectives versus like number words? What do these words mean? But you could also apply it to like what are chairs? What does it mean? What is man? What is gender? What is sex? And basically what he says is that don't look for like an object necessarily that these category words pick out in the world, and instead analyze the way the word is used, basically like anthropologically. So look how humans of a language community are using this word. So he says that the use of the word is sort of connected to a practice. So in order to understand what the word red means, I guess, you would have to look at the kinds of situations where actual people use the word red. So when distinguishing between things of different colors, red apples versus green apples, or situations like that. So you have to sort of learn, in order to understand what the word red means, like it's not just enough to give a dictionary definition per se, you have to also know how humans are using this sound red, right? Like what situations do we say that in, and why do we do it? So it's a different way of thinking about language, but one I think is really helpful as a kind of starting point when you're asking questions about, especially like really like big like sociological questions or philosophical questions, like what is a man or what is a woman? Like these are questions where I think like doing this kind of like use analysis is really helpful. So, I mean, let's apply these things basically to start looking at the concept of biological sex. So, with respect to humans, anyway, the like basic way you'll see male or female defined is that these terms male or female describe sexual characteristics, are of a sort of basic dimorphism or of reproductive roles and of anatomy and of physiology. Particularly anatomy and physiology is what people usually propose when they want to say if someone is male or female. So that includes things like chromosomes, XX or XY usually, gonads, ovaries or testes, genitals, obvious, hormones like ratio of estrogen to testosterone, and then secondary sex characteristics, breast, facial hair, and skin texture. And I guess I want to say that if that's how we understand biological sex, then physically, or in terms of purely looking at this empirically, I don't think it's really binary, but it's not exactly a spectrum either. So I guess it's not binary because, let's go ahead a slide. There's lots of examples of sex that doesn't correspond to either this pure male or pure female category. So, for example, a lot of transsexual people will alter their natal hormones, secondary sex characteristics, genitals. And I just want to do a note about the word transsexual, because I know people are watching the stream who might object. I'm using the word transsexual because it is used in a lot of the medical literature, including biology by trans people like Julia Serrano. It's just a common word that's used in the scientific literature. Sometimes people can consider this word a slur when it's just used like a transsexual to refer to someone. But because this is how this is the word scientists use, I'm going to use it in this lecture. And usually the word transsexual is used to distinguish between people who are broadly transgender, which includes everyone who just simply is not the gender they were assigned at birth, and people who go about seeking to change their biology in some way, which is the thing that makes you transsexual according to this definition. Again, some trans people don't like it because they find it sort of exclusive, but we don't need to get into that right now. So I guess the question is, if you're, for instance, a male to female transsexual woman, then you probably have, if you do, say, hormone replacement therapy, you then have a female, so you have a female estrogen to testosterone ratio. You have a lot of female secondary sex characteristics, including probably breasts, smoother skin. It affects even things like the smell of your sweat and things. A lot of times trans women have facial hair removed. I mean, some people will get genital reassignment surgery, in which case that anatomical structure is altered. So you sort of have a person here who checks maybe half this list as male and half this list as female. And you get maybe even biologically even more interesting situations when you start looking at intersex people. So there's a variety of intersex conditions, some of which involve sort of sex chromosome combinations other than XX or XY. So there's Klinefelter syndrome with XXY, Turner syndrome with just an X. And there's a really interesting one called Swyer syndrome, which is where you have someone with normal XY sex chromosomes, but for reasons I don't fully understand, they basically, you all probably know this. What is the gene? It's like the SRY gene, I think, that switches on the sort of initial, in the womb, the sexing, basically, the initial sexual. You start out female basically as a fetus, and then you become male. If Mel, you look like you want to explain this.
Yeah. Well, I can't really explain it in detail, but SRY is the sex determination gene for male, which is really confusing when you have stuff like there's this weird little vole somewhere in Estonia called Ilobius lutescens, and it doesn't have SRY. So clearly these things are having sex and they're making babies, but we have no idea how they're doing it because we have no idea how their genes decide when one is going to be male or one is going to be female. Like with us, we know this will make you this and this will make you this, and if you don't have that, it'll be something in between. But with certain creatures, we just have no idea.
I should learn more about this because it's super interesting.
Yeah, well, I guess the thing that I'd like to add to it is that the way that biology is taught in high school, right? The way that we learned about the way that genetics works is we have this idea of a one-to-one relationship between genotype and phenotype of oh, there are these genes and they cause this in this really simplistic causal way. And then when you actually look at it, you find out that there's genes that code for things, and then there are really, really complicated causal loops that produce traits. And there isn't a clear relationship between them. So it shouldn't be at all surprising to us that even though sex is a functional thing that is going to be coded for in many different places and have lots of different lots of different ways to express it, and you can get to the same end point from multiple developmental pathways. So it's just not simple.
And it's not like this is known. It's not like we have a clear idea. I mean, even as a biologist, typically working biologists will have some idea that someone else who's a more advanced geneticist has or embryologist has some idea of how embryogenesis takes information encoded in the genome and then transforms this undifferentiated goop in an egg into a fully formed creature with a certain phenotype. And we just don't know. I mean, we have ideas, but we have no idea, really. Like it's not clear cut.
Very mysterious. But yeah, so the point is, I guess, that there's people with Swyer syndrome who have the XY karyotype, is that the right word? But they do not end up phenotypically male because this gene just never gets activated at the point or something, and so they end up with, I guess it's called, they don't end up unable to reproduce, but they do have like ovaries, a uterus, a vagina, like, and they won't go through female puberty without artificial hormones. So I mean, someone with Swyer syndrome, like, they're checking almost all the female list except for chromosomes. So the reason I say it's that, I think, makes the binary thinking a simplification. Okay, and in some situations maybe the simplification is justified, but you know, part of what's going on when we have these debates, or at least I have these debates with people about, is biological sex binary? I mean, to be honest, a lot of times the scientific or philosophical debate is a proxy for a political debate. So what's really in question is, you know, whether we want to call, for instance, trans women biologically male, whether we want to consider intersex people to belong to a third sex category, for example. And this ends up being a kind of, like I say, it's a proxy battle over social gender roles, basically. And not really generally actually about biology at all. But I guess, so I think, like, you know, scientifically, I don't know if I would really call biological sex a spectrum either, or because it's not exactly continuous, right? It's not like the spectrum of light where you have these little gradations, or you could divide it into very equal gradations. Like, I've heard people call, I don't know how we think about this term, but I've heard people call biological sex a bimodal distribution, where you have kind of like two big like humps in this graph that where most people sort of cluster around one set of traits or other. Go ahead.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. And then there's, it's uncommon, but you have like various degrees of in between. So I sort of, I'm undecided about exactly how to think of it, but I think that to just insist that sex is binary because most people have this cluster doesn't, I think it leaves a lot of information out. Okay. So I guess, yeah, the political thing takes us to the sex versus gender conversation. So I guess the most like standard way of explaining this is just to say sex is biological, that's chromosomes, gonads, hormones, all that stuff. And then gender is just social. So it's like gender roles, you know, gender presentation, whether you present femme or butch. It's, you know, the power relationships surrounding gender of, you know, patriarchal relations or whatever. All this stuff is supposed to be is gender. The complication is that there's not necessarily, I think, a clear-cut division between the social and the biological side of this. And there's sort of a mutual influence where, I mean, it's clear that something about gender roles as we know them probably originates in the fact that generally female people play a certain reproductive role and have certain physical attributes. That probably has an influence on our social notions of gender. But on the other hand, the social notions of gender can also alter the biology in various ways. I feel like I had a really good example of this that I can now not come up with, but here's a less good example that I just thought of. Like the perception that men are generally biologically stronger can lead to social reinforcement of this idea, a norm that men should be biologically strong, should be physically strong, which leads men to then develop this attribute beyond more than women develop the attribute, leading to sort of an increase in sexual dimorphism that's not purely attributable to non-social influences. So I think that to say that there's strictly, I don't think it's possible to strictly separate gender and sex.
Can I offer another example? It's not about gender, but it's even more clear than, I mean, that one's fantastic. But there's another one that gets into the genome, which is, you can talk, like the most common one that people talk about is animal domestication, and that the genes that we have for digesting milk, lactose tolerance and things, like that's totally, like it's in our genome. Some people are lactose tolerant, some aren't. And it evolved to be that way because we started domesticating cattle. And so here's a cultural process that's actually gone through and affected the way our genes work. So there's no clear distinction between the two.
Yeah.
Vocab lesson for students, that's called dual inheritance, when we have or culture gene co-evolution, when you have biology impacting culture, and then the cultural norms going back to then impact stuff in the actual genome.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I wish I had thought of more examples of this pertaining specifically to gender. I'm sure there are other examples, but I don't need to necessarily dwell on this too long anyway. But I just wanted to sort of mention that as a kind of side note about how we talk about sex and gender. So I guess before I go on to the next thing, let's just like make sure that everyone's familiar with like basics of the vocabulary around transgender people. So we call what people often call biologically male or biologically female. Most trans people prefer to refer to as sex assignment. So sex assignment is just what the doctor says when you're born, male, female, boy, girl, generally. A lot of times intersex people with ambiguous phenotypes get surgically corrected quote corrected without consent. So there's another case where social norms sort of have reinforced at least phenotypic sex binary by surgically removing intermediate cases or surgically altering. So the jargony terms are assigned male at birth or assigned female at birth, AMAB. So AMAB or AFAB for short. So I was assigned male at birth, though I now identify as a trans woman. So transgender, basically it just so first of all, this is an adjective, not a noun. People aren't transgenders. They are transgender men or transgender women. And usually it's shortened to trans woman, trans man. And basically the only thing that I think you can say in general about trans people is that they are in some way not at home with or comfortable with or the sex or gender they were assigned at birth, and instead prefer to live their life as a different gender. Anything you want to say on top of that, I think, is a generalization, because there's a lot of different ways people are trans. And then cisgender, cis, or cis for short, this is just the way of, it's just the way of marking the majority. So, straight is to gay as cis is to trans. It just means that you are the same gender as your assigned sex. So a cis woman or a cis man is just someone who is assigned, a cis woman was assigned female at birth and just lives and identifies as a woman. A cis man, same thing except man. And then lastly, non-binary means someone is or identifies as a gender other than a man or woman. So they reject the binary categorization, social categorization, and identity categorization when applied to themselves. And so we're going to abbreviate that as NB. So gender identity, this is a big philosophical concept that I feel like I thought I understood it like 6 months ago, and now I'm having this crisis again where I'm like, wait, what is gender identity? But I'll say a little bit about it now. Basically, it's the gender a person psychologically identifies as. So there's a lot of confusion around the term, this like phraseology, identify as. So you get people, on YouTube, you get all these people who will object and say, I identify as an attack helicopter, blah, blah, I identify as a, whatever, because they're mocking you, right? They're making fun of the idea of being trans. It's basically what that is, right? It's not a serious objection, but I mean, suppose you were, basically, the idea, the suggestion is that like trans people are in some way delusional, right? They think there's something they're not. That's not true. I mean, it's probably true in like 1 in 100,000 cases, because anything that's possible is true. But like, if most trans people are very acutely aware of the biological and social reality surrounding them, like, so what does it mean to identify as? It's not just like wish thinking. It's not just, oh, I wish this. Like, for instance, got to a point in my life where I was like so uncomfortable with my life as a man that I decided that I just, despite how difficult I knew it was going to be, was going to start a whole lengthy, expensive, difficult series of medical procedures, and training my voice to be more feminine, and reconfiguring the whole way I live my life. Why? What does it mean to identify as a gender? Well, I think that probably the easiest way to understand it is to not get too hung up on this idea of like psychological identification, because that language, to me, I think it sort of implies that there's like some inner singularity of like feeling what it means to be a woman or something, or what it means to be a man. And no one knows what you're talking about when you say that. I don't even really understand what that would be like myself. So to me, the way I think of it just has to do with sort of a feeling of being at home in your body, or feeling that your body is alien to you. So sometimes, I've talked to some trans people who will say that they actually get like almost like phantom limb sensations, like, right? Like trans men will feel like they ought to have a penis. And I don't just mean like they wish they had a penis, but they'll actually like almost a phantom limb sensation of having that body part. And likewise, a lot of trans women, their relation to the genitals they're born with is like that it's alien. And I think that there's actually a study, I think this is Ramachandran or his pupil, neuroscientist, did a study on, I guess, like trans people who have had genital reassignment surgery. I think it was just trans women who had genital reassignment surgery. And it showed that they had much less frequent cases of like phantom limb after they had their surgery than, say, cis men who have like their genitals removed for various reasons, surgical reasons. So when you identify with this part, it's the sort of biology aspect, or the body aspect, has to do with like feeling that your body is supposed to be a certain way, and that it's not for some reason, and that you want to change that. So that's why, to me, it's not delusional, because you're aware that your body is not the way you feel it ought to be, and then that dissonance creates tension, which you seek to relieve through medically transitioning. So that, I think, is something that is maybe easier to understand than trying to think about what it means to feel like a woman. But it's not, I don't want to just reduce it to medical procedures and the body stuff either, because often what transition also means is that you present as a woman, or live as a woman, or present as a man, or live as a man, or as non-binary. So what does it mean to present as? Basically, it means to alter your physical appearance to sort of meet some expectations about what that gender is. So oftentimes to trans people, it's it's important to us, or to be gendered correctly. In other words, so for me, I don't like being called a man. I don't like being called by he pronouns. That feels sort of alien to me. It feels like a misunderstanding of who I am. So one way to help with that is to, why am I teaching it? Why am I wearing makeup to teach a class? Would a cis woman do that? Well, I don't know if some of them would, but to me, I am like a makeup fiend, because I have to cover beard shadow until I manage to get all that off. And because it helps me be perceived by the world as a woman, which for one thing, I mean, I also, it helps me look in the mirror and feel better about the way I look too. But it also, it just smooths over social interactions, like, it's just you make it easier for the people around you to see you as the gender you want to be seen, and that just makes your life easier. So that's what gender presentation is. That's not connected to that's more sociological, I guess, than biological. And then to live as your gender, I mean, that's also kind of that's, I guess, a big philosophical question. What does it mean to live as a man or live as a woman? I think that's something, it's going to mean something different to everyone. But part of it is going to involve, switching your pronouns, changing your name. These kinds of presentations are part of it. But like I said, it's going to be different for different people. So I just want to talk a little bit about medically, what are some of the things that trans people do? So again, disclaimer, different trans people have different preferences when it comes to what they choose to do. So don't assume that everyone who's trans wants all this stuff, because there's like, basically you do what you can afford, for one thing, because a lot of stuff is extremely expensive, and you do what is necessary for your own comfort and happiness. So some people have what used to be called sex reassignment surgery. We're now calling it gender confirmation surgery, or simply genital reassignment. What that does is obvious. Top surgery is what trans men will have to get rid of breasts, and that tends to be very important to a lot of trans men. Some trans women will have facial feminization surgery. That helps with presentation. But I think the most biologically interesting thing that trans people do is hormone replacement therapy, which does all kinds of things. So basically, if you are a trans man, what you're going to do is take injections of testosterone, basically, and that causes effects basically similar, or in some cases identical, to what happens to cis men who go through puberty. So that includes the thickening of vocal cords, which leads to you having a more masculine voice, growth of facial hair and body hair, more musculature, enlargement of the clitoris. It has like effects on menstrual cycle. It can lead to male pattern balding, changes to the texture of your skin, changes of skin odor, increased sex drive, just a huge variety of things that it does. Because a huge number, I mean, you have so much of your body is receptive to sex hormones. It's kind of amazing, like how thorough a thing it is in terms of it changing, like just a giant number of like organ systems in subtle ways. For male to female hormone replacement therapy, that induces breast development, softening of the skin, decreased body hair growth, and kind of a redistribution of body fat in a feminine pattern. So less body fat around your stomach, more around your hips and chest, decreased muscle mass. If you haven't finished your natal male puberty, then it can induce widening of the hips. It changes your, could change like the texture and size of your genitals. It's it's like you stop producing sperm, or at least mostly stop producing it. And it has like radical effects on your sex drive and mood. And that is all the stuff I've been feeling in the last 4 months. So it's pretty interesting. It's, I guess, part of what I think is probably the most interesting contribution to the discussion about trans people and biological sex, because it's not just a change to external anatomy. It's like a whole physiological reworking of multiple systems of your body. And more on that in a second. So I guess another biological question to consider is why people are trans in the first place. So why is it that some people have this experience of being like just like radically uncomfortable in their own bodies? Or why is it that some people assigned male at birth feel that they are women? Or why some people assigned female at birth feel that they are men, or feel that they're non-binary? Well, there is sort of, and the short version of this is that we don't know, and it's inconclusive. But there's been some research done on this, especially recently, that's showed some, at least pointed us in some basic direction. So biologically, there was a study done on transsexual twins, which showed a much higher degree of identity concordance among identical twins compared to fraternal twins. So I think it was for identical twins assigned male at birth, 33% of those twins were both trans women. And it's not quite that much, but almost as much for trans men who are twins. So that suggests at least, and then I think for fraternal twins, 0% of them were both transgender. So that suggests that there's definitely some kind of genetic influence, but it's certainly not only genetics. So what else could it be? It could be differences in prenatal environment, because you can have that even with twins. It could be, it could be environmental, although the idea that it's environmental is kind of discredited at the moment, in part because of like this. There's a variety of reasons, but part of it's like the David Reimer case. I think that's his name. This boy who, this is John Money, the sex researcher, I guess had a botched circumcision and just ended up having, as an infant, his penis removed, and they decided, well, just raise this baby as a girl. Well, he knew by the time he was in adolescence that like this was like radically wrong somehow, that he didn't feel like a girl. So that suggests that cis people also have like, never mind what your socialization, there seems to be some sense of gender identity or some sense of having a sexed body that comes down to something more than just social pressure. But again, we don't know the whole story, and clearly it's not just genetics. There's some studies on the brain, neuroscience studies. So one of the first studies showed that a brain region called the BSTC, I can't remember what this stands for. I think it's like the bed nucleus of the sulcus. I don't know. I'm just making it up. But basically, it's like it's a tiny brain region. So it's not like this is like a microscopic. Like it's one nucleus in the brain, and the brain stem actually that's related to fear and sexuality. I think it's like connected to the amygdala. For those of you who care about neuroanatomy. So it does seem like it would be relevant to gender or sex, and it does have a more cross-sex typical size in trans people. So for trans men, they have a BSTC volume that's more similar to that of cis men and than to cis women, and same with trans women. Theirs is more similar in volume to cis women than to cis men. Another one shows a similar effect with gray matter volume in one cortex region, the putamen, for trans women. Another one showed white matter microstructure pattern, that should be in trans non-HRT trans men. So these first three studies, they all make some effort to control for the effects of hormones. So for instance, I think in the first one, they were comparing trans women to cis men who for some reason had taken like spironolactone, testosterone blockers, I don't know, female hormones, but basically they're not perfect efforts to control for it, because obviously one thing you might think is like, well, hold on, like what are we measuring here? Are we just measuring the effects of hormones on your brain? But they've tried to control for it, but it's not perfect. So there was also a study, this was 2006, HRT does induce sex-specific brain changes. So some variety of sex neurological attributes actually change as a result of hormones. So this is what I'm talking about when I say that taking HRT affects multiple organ systems. Like it affects the anatomy and physiology of your brain even. So that's interesting. But basically, my summary of this evidence is that probably there's a little bit of a genetic or uterine environment kind of causal role, but it's simplistic to say that. You sometimes hear like talk, oh, trans women they have women's brains and men's bodies. So first of all, I think the idea of women's brains is somewhat suspect to begin with, but I think it's even to the extent that it's not suspect, to the extent that there are sort of sex-specific trends, at least in like sort of micro brain anatomy, it's not even the case that trans women's brains look like exactly like cis women's brains. They just look more like cis women's brains than like cis men's brains. So some of these articles will use like, they'll say like there's like a transsexual brain, which I don't know how you feel about that, but that's like one hypothesis, basically, that trans people have sort of brain anatomy that's in these like little, and again, like I say, I emphasize these are like pretty small regions. Mostly our brains aren't like incredibly, there's not a huge amount of like neural sex dimorphism, but in these little areas where there are, and including things like, density of white matter and stuff, which I know women have like more white matter density and so on. Like there's a slight tendency for trans people to have cross-sex attributes. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that hormones do have a feminizing or masculinizing effect on the brain. So you can also, by taking hormones, if you take like testosterone and you're AFAB, you can masculinize your brain to some extent, or if you're trans woman, you can feminize your brain to a certain extent. Oh gosh, well, I'm going to use myself as a guinea pig here. Basically, like the biological question would be like, biologically, would I be considered male or female? I mean, I'll tell you how I think about it myself. There's kind of, in terms of like trans activism and how trans people think about themselves, there's mixed opinions and strong feelings about this question. So I know trans women who say, I am biologically male, but my gender is female, and so I identify as a woman even though I'm biologically male. I also know trans women who say, I am a woman, therefore my body is female, because the word female, in part of the complication here, is that the words male and female, we may use them a specific way in science and biology, but colloquially, in everyday language, when you say female, you think woman, right? Like we all use these words these ways in kind of everyday language. So to say that someone has a male body or a female body, like that can be kind of misgendering. So that's, I think, the motivation for that kind of language. But the way I personally think of my body, and this is the philosopher in me talking, I think, is that I had until recently what would be called, I mean, I actually don't know because I've never gotten my like chromosomes tested, so who knows, there's a small chance that I'm intersex or something, but probably not. So I think probably I had until recently just what would be described, what I would be comfortable anyway describing as a male body, male physiology, typical patterns associated with that. But increasingly, I think there's ambiguity as a result of the hormones that I'm taking. So, I mean, I've noticed dramatic sort of emotional effects. I have, my sex drive has fallen off a cliff. I have much smoother skin just in the last few months. These are sort of the first thing that happens on hormones. My tits constantly hurt because they're growing. Sorry if this is too much information. This is what happens when you let leftist SJWs teach classes. I think that, well, I mean, there's a whole variety of interesting shit going on with my body. And I think that in some ways that amounts to it becoming less male or becoming more sort of ambiguous. So that's how I think about it. I mean, but I think it's kind of an open question still. Like, I don't necessarily have a definite answer for the right way to think about this. So I guess, no, I don't want to seem like I have a dogmatic view here. Okay, so this is called radical transbiology. So what does that mean? Well, I've been thinking about this. I mean, one thing that's radical about, for instance, the process of taking cross-sex hormones and of deciding that actually, no, I'm not just going to do what nature handed me in terms of my biological sex. I'm going to start making changes. Is that this has a destabilizing effect on the sex-gender binary as a sort of social and political institution. Now, some people question that. I mean, I definitely hear this all the time, like, oh, actually trans people are just reinforcing gender stereotypes because it's just telling masculine women that they have to be men or telling feminine men that they have to be women. Well, no one's telling anyone that. And I know a lot of trans people at this point. I don't know any of them who think that a man's being feminine means that he should become a woman. Like, no, that's not what it is. Like, you can be a feminine man or a masculine woman without being trans. And also, I think that a piece of evidence for the destabilizing theory is that most ordinary people, when you tell them that you were raised a different sex and gender and that you have changed it, are like, what the fuck? And like, so I think it's a thing that's like surprising to people, that violates their expectations for what gender and sex mean. So I personally find it to be transitioning to be one of the more radical deviations you can make from gender roles and from society's expectations about sex and gender. The other way that I think could be considered radical is that it's kind of a baby step in the direction of like very sophisticated biological self-determination. So we are not satisfied, we're uncomfortable and unhappy with our sex assigned at birth, so we start taking hormones and start doing surgery. Who knows what the future is going to hold for humans, but like, it's conceivable that this is kind of an early experiment and people doing all kinds of things to change their biology. It doesn't, whether we want to take this in like a kind of transhumanist way, I don't know. I don't personally spend much time speculating about that kind of science fiction stuff, but I think it's certainly possible that that could be a possibility in the future. And I think in some ways, trans people are kind of like pioneering a version of that. You could think of hormone replacement therapy almost, it uses like all like natural pathways in your body, because your body, whether you're sex male or female, your body has the capacity to do either of these secondary sex attributes, and you can just sort of switch what you can sort of mess around with your phenotype by changing your hormones. So I guess that to me seems like it's a potentially radical step in a new direction for what's possible in a human life. And I just want to close by returning to the question, what is a man, what is a woman? Well, I think it's, I think it's bad philosophy, basically, to even ask, what is a real woman, what is a real man? I don't think these are well-formed ideas. Like, I don't think that, even considering all this discussion of biology and gender and all the thinking that I've done about it, I don't have any sense that it's moving towards a final answer to the question of what does it really mean to be a woman or something like that. Like, I think this is asking, like, what does it mean to be human, or like, what is justice? Like, this is just like, it's such a fundamental identity question that it's like, you answer this question by living or something like that, and different societies will have different answers. And so these are not questions that can be given final answers. These are questions that are sort of questions for ongoing exploration. I feel like I'm sounding like a really like hippie, like wishy-washy right now, but like, hopefully this is making sense. Okay, that's probably enough talking from me for now. We can do, if people have questions or thoughts or objections, I think that, let me stop screen sharing here. I'm happy to switch to that.
Great. That was so great. Thank you for laying out all that information. Well, so I've been taking notes. I have a number of things I want to ask you, but I probably talk too much. So maybe there are some other people that want to start the conversation, and then I can jump in.
I did have a question.
Yeah.
So as far as intersex individuals, do they, I don't know if anyone can answer, but do they kind of go through any hormone replacement therapies to kind of, I guess, make them feel more at home with the body? Because if they have characteristics of both, I guess, biological sexes, what do they usually, do to kind of make them feel more at home with that?
So it totally depends on which type of intersex condition you have. Like, there are a lot of intersex people don't even know that they're intersex, because what they have is like a chromosomal abnormality that doesn't really show up phenotypically, or if it does, it shows up in like extremely tall women, for example, as I think like the XXX karyotype. So in some intersex people, it's just not an issue. With people with Swyer syndrome, for instance, they pretty much, so far as I know, almost always identify as women, because they have other generally female phenotype. They do have to take hormones at puberty in order to have puberty, because they won't go through it otherwise. But as far as like intersex people with like ambiguous genitals and things, most of them as I understand it, identify as cis. Like their parents raised them as one gender, corresponding to whichever gender seems more natural for them based on their anatomy at birth. And most of them stick with that. But there are also intersex trans people too. So it just totally depends. I'm sure, I actually don't know that much about intersex trans people, but most intersex people are not trans, and they have a different experience. And for the most part, they don't take any kind of cross-sex hormones unless that's something that they need to have like a normal puberty or normal hormone levels.
Okay.
So one thing that I wanted to ask you is, for me, one of the more poignant moments in the films that you've made about this are, you have this like musical interlude where you say it's 2017, man, and you did some nice techno beats with that. And I guess to me, like what it stuck out to me for is that there seemed to be this like implicit recognition that there's something unique about being trans in 2017, which is not what it's like to be trans in 1990 or what it will be like in 2050. And so I guess I'm wondering what you think about what gender is now. I'm not exactly sure what question I'm trying to ask here, but just like the temporal nature of gender.
So there's clearly some kind of cultural moment that's happening with respect to trans people. And this is framed often in the press, especially, for instance, the English press, which is very hostile to trans people, as being a kind of like, what is this new crazy epidemic of gender deviance? Like, I think basically the articles written like that are basically the same as these 90s kind of conservative commentators complaining that MTV is turning everyone gay. Like, why are there so many gay people all of a sudden? Well, there are not actually more gay people. What there are is more people who are being open about it. And there's always been trans people. It's like a very consistent thing across societies that a certain percentage of the population, usually a bit under 1% of the population, will be trans. Now that means very different things in different cultures. So we know, for instance, in a lot of Native American cultures, there's this idea of being two-spirit, which anthropologically, I don't know that much about it, but there are people today who are from, indigenous American communities who identify as two-spirit. And that I assume has different cultural connotations to our idea of transgender. I think how to explain the apparent increase in people who are trans, I think part of it is that, a lot of people who otherwise would not have been able to come up with the sort of courage or resources to transition suddenly have role models, and they have examples to follow, and they have greater degrees of social acceptance. I know I think in the 1950s, when the first genital reassignment surgery was performed in the United States, there was a newspaper article about this, and the surgeon who did the operation immediately got like 3,000 or 4,000 like inquiries about doing this. So back in the 50s, like there were people who like wanted to, but it wasn't like it wasn't a realistic option. And it's become more of a realistic option. It's become easier to imagine doing, I think, because of the publicity around it. But I think that there are a lot of people who just kind of have these feelings, gender dysphoria feelings, that have just kind of lived with them and just never transitioned. And now suddenly people are being more open about it. That's my sense for what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
As far as like, what does it mean in 2017? Well, that part of that is just like sort of self-parody about like there being like something very 2017 about being like a trans YouTuber.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I guess what I wanna try to go back to that idea of the functionalist idea, right? Because the biologist in me says that if you see a trait that is spreading in a population, it must be because the trait is adaptive, which like may just be bad thinking, right? Like it could just be bullshit. But
Yeah.
but there, Mel's making a face, maybe she thinks it's bullshit. But I don't know, there's part of me that thinks that there might actually be like we're entering into this phase where what sex is and what gender is not they don't play the same biological functions or the same reproductive functions as they did a few centuries ago. But that doesn't mean that they play no function, right? And like I guess I'm sort of just like thinking out loud here, but like you have in many ways made a career out of being a trans woman on YouTube, right? And so at least in a very local sense, it's worked for you, right?
Because I was becoming successful before I came out as trans.
Okay.
I don't think I'm just famous for being trans. In other words, I think I'm famous. I think I'm known for my anti-alt-right videos first and foremost. So no, I don't think this is any kind of successful strategy for me. I think actually it would have been easier not to be trans. But I mean, I think that this kind of like functionalist thinking about this in the terms of like why is it suddenly adaptive for people to be trans? I think that's sort of alien to the way trans people think of themselves, for one thing, because no one thinks, I mean, I don't think of it as like something I'm doing for like these kinds of practical motivations. Like I know like sometimes like kind of shitlordy sexologists will characterize trans women, for instance, who live as homosexual men before they transition. They'll characterize the transition as a kind of like sexual strategy or like ploy to sleep with straight men. I don't think that's what it is. I'll just say it's not what it is. You know, people transition because of gender dysphoria. Like, transition is a traumatic, difficult thing that, like, for so many people, they lose their families still. Like, they incur huge expenses and huge like losses to financially and just emotionally. Like, it's not something that you would do for any kind of like practical motivation. I can't see why. I don't think anyone would transition unless they felt that that was the only way they could be happy.
Again, I think that when we start talking about what's fit or what's adaptive in terms of cultural evolutionary entities, we run into trouble. And there are people who study cultural evolution and say that there must be some objective way of getting at fitness or adaptivity in terms of cultural products, but no one's willing to say what that might be. I think because anything you could think of would be kind of wrong. I mean, there's just no objective way of, like, spreading to fixation in population. It's not gonna get at a metric of what's fit. And so again, the use case model is, I think, akin to a functionalist model, but again, it's like a functionalist model, except that it has no normative claim to it, and it's obligately kind of a collective property.
So I guess the goal is to just, sorry to make sure I'm clear on this, is the goal of this to sort of do almost like a meme type analysis of this culture, where you kind of look at these cultural ideas or memes and decide like why it is that they are catching on? Like, is that?
I mean, that's a question that I have.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm hesitant to view being trans as foremost a cultural meme, in part because I think so much of it seems to be biological, or seems to have origins in factors that seem to go beyond social, just like social conventions. However, I do think that, biology is always expressed in a particular cultural situation. And so the particular form that it takes, yes, is probably unique to our society and our time. Like, there's probably a difference, like I said, between being two-spirit and being transgender as we, Western or European origin Americans understand it. There probably is a difference between being transgender and being sort of the sort of equivalent third gender, or there's various sort of analogs in, like, South Asian cultures, and in Southeast Asian cultures, in Japanese history, pre-colonial Japan, like, but these the discovery, for instance, the availability of hormone replacement therapy is a big deal, as well as the kind of surgical procedures that are available to trans people that historically have not been available to people around the world. And I think that discovery or that innovation is like a giant thing. Like it's it's much more difficult, I think, to live. Like I have trouble. It's amazing. I haven't been on hormones that long, but I'm already like, I cannot imagine life without this. Like it would be very difficult for me personally to live my life without the hormones. People do it, of course they do. So you don't have to have it, but I think that the hormones do make it a more attractive option, and in some ways they make it easier. So I think that there's a biological innovation that sort of changes what it means to be trans or transsexual. And then there's also, just the like I said, the availability of the idea. Like I think before, when I was younger, before I ever thought of myself as trans, like I had certain feelings that I think I would call gender dysphoria, but I didn't have this like conceptual language to describe it. So it was just a vague, I just knew something was kind of wrong. Like I sort of didn't like the way people saw me. I felt that there was something that that I would never put into words, but that once I was sort of started becoming more educated about trans people and, talking to trans people and things, I realized like, like that's what's going on with me. And like, so of course, you can't have the thought like, oh, I'm transgender until you know what being transgender is. So that, in that sense, you could say it's sociological, because being transgender is obviously a social construct, like everything that we come up with. So having the ability of that construct plus this biological disposition to be sort of physically uncomfortable in your natal sexed body, like that's to me is the combination that makes the current idea of transgender happen, or transsexual.
Thank you. That was
And so I was thinking, is there like, because I know you made mention about research being done about, a human brain and how, people have like a change, in the human brain. I was thinking, is there like any ongoing research on how to determine like children or babies, rather than just, using sex, to determine their gender, or, I don't know how to put it, but is there like anything apart from like, the phenotypical aspect of, the baby?
Yeah. So you're asking like, is it possible to sort of medically determine like whether a baby or a young child is going to be trans? I mean, at the moment, no, there's not. So there's a big controversy going on in the press right now about trans children, and this is something that there's been recent like revolution in how we deal with medically and psychiatrically. So there are trans children, like there's a lot of children who have strong feelings or declarations of cross-sex identification from like a very early age. There is no way to like scan a child's brain and say like, oh, they're definitely transgender. What I will say about the research is that, there's a misconception that children transitioning means that, oh, people are going to transition children who are gender nonconforming, or like, oh, this is going to be used to erase homosexuals because like, girls who are lesbians are going to be turned into men, or so. This is like not at all what the psychiatric practice dictates. In order for you to get this, like, in order for children to transition, and to be clear, what children transitioning means is simply, until puberty, it just means changing their name, changing how they dress, right? Like, which I think, people hear trans children is kind of a panic word for a lot of people, because it like summons this image of like children getting like genital reassignment surgery and stuff that never is done. That's never done. You generally have to be 18 before that's even an option. And what is done medically, and in some cases, is that when children with strong cross-sex identification, so in other words, if a female at birth, for instance, and she says, or sorry, he says, I feel like a boy, I am a boy, I know I should be a boy, and this is like a consistent feeling, what they will sometimes do is take puberty blockers once they reach, I think it's like usually Tanner stage 2, they let it hit. I was just reading about this recently, but I think that it's an interesting idea, but they'll allow the children to hit the first stage of puberty because that's considered diagnostically relevant. Because if they begin the wrong puberty, puberty that they're going to experience natally, and that's really dysphoria triggering, that's a good indication that they're probably trans. So that's when they'll start the puberty blockers. And puberty blockers are basically have reversible effects. They simply delay the onset of puberty for a few years, which buys time, in other words, to see if, by age 15 or 16, if this person is still has strong cross-sex identification. And then at that point, they can begin, in some cases, hormone replacement therapy. Is there a way, again, to determine, like, from just a brain scans or from neurology, whether they're trans? No, there's no way to do that, unfortunately. Well, maybe it's not unfortunate, but there's no way to do it. But most cases of people who have, kids who have consistent cross-sex identification generally do turn out to be trans. There's a misleading statistic that's often circulated about desistance. The idea that it's said that like 80% of children who come into gender clinics will end up just being cisgender later. The reason that that's misleading is that a lot of these children are children who never really had strong cross-sex identification, gender identification to begin with. So they were brought to the clinic because they were sort of gender nonconforming or had other sort of gender issues, but absent the really strong cross-sex identification, that generally is the indication that you have like a child who's going to transition. So, traditionally, like, children couldn't transition, and a lot of parents are, of course, very hostile to the idea. So I know a lot of adult trans people who have a lot of regret about the fact that they had to wait so long in life in order to do this, and wish that they could have done it younger. But it remains like this ongoing public controversy.
I kind of have a question, or like just thought process going off of that. So just this past school semester, I was taking a contemporary health issues class, and we watched a documentary about children who were transgender, and they were unhappy with the body that they were born in and wanted to undergo, hormone therapy or the puberty blockers like you were talking about. And I guess because now that the conversation is being had, that younger children are recognizing that they might be trans. And I guess I was wondering if it is, that it's becoming a bit more accepted and, more, yeah, I guess more, people are accepting that they are trans and being more public about it, that, it's okay for young children to kind of like come out to their parents and say, I'm unhappy with my body as it is. And if that's why there is an increase in trans children. And I'm also, wondering if you go so many years because, your parents tell your children you can't make these decisions. So you go so many years being unhappy with your body. At what age are you allowed to, make the decision, this is who I am and I want to follow through with puberty blockers or hormone therapy or, whatever it is you feel will make you more comfortable?
So yeah, the first part of your question was why there seems to be an increase in trans children. And I think it has to do with is not so much that children are coming out to their parents more, as that the parents are reacting differently to that. So the fact that more parents are aware that being trans is a thing, kids are getting taken to gender clinics instead of just beaten or whatever, because these are the stories that I hear from times past when that's what would happen to you. Like if your parents would be like, because they thought that there's no way you can live a happy life as the other gender, so get that out of your system now. It was the thought, but like in fact that doesn't work, and you can't discipline transgender feelings out of your mind, out of your brain. So really, what it has to do with is just having the availability of a kind of medical and psychiatric structure that's willing to treat gender nonconforming and trans children, and parents who are aware of this. That's what I think accounts for the child transitioning thing, and I view it as pretty much entirely a good thing. As far as like kids who have not been able to transition because of the attitudes of their parents or the time they were raised, I mean, you can you don't need your parents' permission for any of this once you're 18. Obviously, the financial side of it is still an obstacle, but there's also resources for trans teenagers. I know a lot of trans people who. A lot of trans teenagers end up homeless because of family rejection. So, there are resources for them, but it's still there's a lot of sadness in the world around this, unfortunately. So, yeah.
I have a question about going off of what she said. Most of the focus on transgender people as well as children are we see them on the Western side of the world. Do you think with globalization, the ideas from the West, because in America we don't have a very structured culture where there's one viewpoint, it's like many different viewpoints that then build off and spread their ideas and open up to other people. Do you think that same globalization of cultures would then travel to the East? Because I know there isn't a lot of focus on transgender people in, let's say, Asia. I mean, there is a large focus on Southeast Asia, but that's mostly of the industry down there.
Yeah. So I know. Oh, someone's got music.
Do you think the acceptance of the Western world would go towards the Eastern side in the sense that it's positive and parents are accepting of this rather than it happening and them subjugating these people and in Southeast Asia sexualizing these people?
So yeah, I do think there's probably going to be some influence of the Western trans movement on other parts of the world, but I mean, this puts people a little bit on edge because I know in a lot of countries, the fact that gay and trans liberation movements are presented as Western and imperialistic ideas is used to oppose those liberation movements within those countries. Now, in a lot of cases, this is nonsense because in fact, there's many parts of the world where probably trans people would have been better off before Western colonization in the first place. Because, for instance, in Japan, I know there was a tradition of, onagata performers of kabuki theater who were assigned male at birth, performed as women, and sort of lived their lives as women. And due to Western colonial influence, this was repressed. In North America, Two-Spirit people were very brutally repressed under the rule of European colonists. So a lot of these non-Western cultures have kind of historically over the past few centuries had third gender traditions and transgender sort of at least traditions that sort of resemble transgender people today have had that stuff by colonialism and imperialism shut down. So it's not by any means a purely Western idea. In fact, in some ways the opposite, where the West is only now refiguring out what used to sort of in some sense exist in other cultures. As far as in Asian cultures, whether there's a significant trans presence, I mean, as you say, there's in Thailand, of course, there's a notorious sex industry largely based around ladyboys, which but as a result, in part as a result of that, there's also just trans people there, and there is a lot of American trans women who will go to Thailand to get genital reassignment surgery because some of the best doctors who do it are in Thailand. Other countries, I mean, I've talked to people who go to China, travel in China and Japan, or from China and Japan, and I'm told I've never traveled to Asia, so I couldn't say from experience, but I'm told that it's trans people in these countries are pretty common, and that they're pretty accepted for the most part. It's my understanding of the situation in Japan anyway is that it's pretty acceptable to be trans, although you're expected to be very gender conforming. So if you're going to be a trans woman, you're going to be a woman, and everything that involves no butch trans women, no non-binary stuff, so it's still very rigid in a sense, but you can transition. I mean, I know that even in Iran, you could, in the 80s, get sex reassignment surgery but part of that has to do with an extremely insidious homophobia that thought it was better to become a woman than to be a homosexual man, or more socially acceptable. And there was a coercive element to it. So that's not exactly, I'm not upholding Iran as an example of like transgender liberation by any means. But I do think that it shows like there's sort of, in a way, there's like a Western hang-up about being transgender that we don't have about homosexuality still, which is not universal. Like there's, I think, in fact, it's more common for people to be more okay with people being transgender than being homosexual in a lot of cultures. It happens to be the opposite here. I don't know if that's a good answer to the question or not.
No, yeah, no, I'm understanding that mindset. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, I'm Elmo. Does my microphone work? But you can't see me,
yeah.
Okay. I wanted to say something about brain scans because I thought that was very interesting what you said earlier, and I think there's a tendency to interpret this in a certain way that has to be justified. So when I hear that the certain part of the brain looks a certain way and there's a correlation between this and a certain type of behavior or thought, so we might say this BSTC looks a lot in volume like those of cis women. Then our normal impulse is to say that the brain causes the thoughts, or the brain looks, because the brain looks like this person has these thoughts. And the underlying metaphor is probably one like hardware and software. So we think that what we can see in the brain scan is the hardware that is unchangeable, and the software is just what happens on it. And many people think that this is a very bad metaphor for the brain, because the brain changes with what it thinks. And this is called neuroplasticity. Now I'm not a biologist, I don't know how far this actually carries, but it's conceivable that as an adult, a certain part of your brain would look a certain way because you use it every day to think in a certain way. And I think this is similar to what you said about, for example, muscle mass. Having a lot of muscle mass because you do push-ups every day is part of your body that looks a certain way because of how you behave. And it's not inconceivable that this might also be true for a tiny part of the brain. And not thinking that the brain is necessarily hardware and software, or not immediately assuming that this correlation means that there's a causal relationship that goes in one direction might enable us to interpret this differently.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that caution. I think that if you look at even with the scientists who've done these neuroscience studies themselves, say they don't make a causal claim because it's just not possible to determine, as you say, whether it's these like brain structures are the reason why, like the causal reason why people are transgender, or if it's because of neuroplasticity in some way. So, I mean, I know there's studies, for example, that show that meditation can alter your brain anatomy little ways, or just doing certain mental exercises habitually changes your neuroanatomy. I know that there's like a famous old neuroscience study showing that like cab drivers in London have like a larger hippocampus, this like area associated with memory, because of the like incredible memory task of memorizing the London street maps. So is it possible that the brain is this way because trans people live lives as a different gender, and that involves daily and repeated habits that have effects on brain physiology and anatomy? It's totally possible. So I actually I don't know which direction to point the causal arrow in when it comes to the brain anatomy studies.
Thank you very much. I really like the example of the cab driver. I also like the earlier question about children's brain scans, because of course it would be very interesting if we were able, now we have the study which presumably has adult subjects and brain scans of adult brains of cis and trans people. And it would be very interesting to know what their brains looked like when they were children. But I think already your example of the cab driver, I think no one would say that makes sense to say that someone was born as a cab driver and then later they got the driver's license and then they started doing it as well. So I think this helps me a lot thinking.
Yeah, and I think I'll add to that I'm not holding my breath for neuroscience studies to come out demonstrating, aha, we found the thing that makes people transgender, or geneticists to come out, oh, we found the gene that makes people transgender, because researchers have been looking for something like that to explain sexual orientation for a long time without coming up with anything conclusive. So like there's, again, well, all the things I just said about what are the biological causes of being transgender, a lot of these things, similar things have been sort of discovered with the biological causes or correlates, if we don't want to say causes, biological correlates of homosexuality. So, you know, there's like some little genetic or pre-uterine effect that seems to affect sexuality, which seems to happen, you know, there's like certain attributes of the uterine environment that seem to have an influence on whether someone's homosexual or not. There's like, you know, certain findings in neuroscience that show like correlations, but nothing so, you know, despite a pretty consistent effort to look for something like this, nothing that's like definitive, like, here's the one thing that causes people to become homosexual. Like, we don't have, it's probably not out there. And my guess is that it's not out there for trans people either, because things like something like gender identity is so psychologically and socially complicated that I think looking for a really simple, like one-to-one mapping of like a biological thing to the psychological thing is probably not the right thing to look for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
All right. So I was kind of thinking about it being like more socially, you know, from the philosophical point, because you made mention about, you know, children being brought up in cis homes where, you know, they felt they weren't in their right bodies, but didn't get them, you know, the attention. I'm also thinking that there might be children who are even born in trans homes who might, you know, be influenced by, you know, by their parents or by, you know, by the external, you know, society, or by what they see and by what they do. So it can be, you know, being from like birth or not from birth. Like, I don't know how to put it, but I think, you know, it can be both ways. You know, it can be something I believe we can do, you know, to determine, you know, not only depending on you know, I don't know how to put it, but, you know, I'm trying to, you know, put my words right. But I don't know if you understand what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. So you're suggesting that, like, is there probably the social or environmental factors that also contribute to this? I mean, so maybe I don't know exactly what they are. There was some past research, and like there was a stage of research on trans people where psychologists thought that like some kind of childhood like trauma or something was it led to, or like, you know, some like weird relationship with your mother or father or something led people to be transgender. That's mostly been discredited, or I think entirely been discredited at this point. So it's probably not that, but is there some kind of social aspect? I mean, probably. Like, it's, you know, we know that it's not just genetics.
Right.
And it's, you know, there's the uterine environment thing and exposure to hormones at that stage and things like that. Like, so it's possible that, I mean, that probably does something too. But I mean, is it, you know, even when you've got like, you know, cases of identical twins, and yeah, 33% of them are both transgender, but in the other 66% of cases, you have one transgender twin and one cisgender twin. So what is the difference? It's hard to, we basically just don't know.
Well, like, there's this conservative homophobic horror story, right? Of like, oh, we can't let the gays get married because then they're going to turn everybody gay, or something like that, which like is not, it's not completely false. Like there's an element of truth to that, like that when something social, yeah, I'll let you go.
Well, what you're suggesting is that like the social normalization and acceptance of homosexuality will probably lead to more people being gay.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Like, and it's probably true of trans people too, that if being transgender is accepted, more people will decide to transition. But I think that it's not that, in this case, it's not that people are becoming trans or becoming gay just because of social changes. You know what I'm saying?
like the only, I feel like the only way that would lead to more people being trans or more people being gay is in the sense that if you make it more socially acceptable, you're going to see less suicides or hate crimes amongst a population that, I mean, people aren't turning trans or turning gay. People are coming out as trans or coming out as gay because it's socially acceptable.
Yeah, you get increased visibility of it. You got, more people willing to accept this aspect of themselves in the first place. You know, I'm sure many figures of world history have been gay or trans, but happen to live in places where this was just so frowned upon that they just didn't explore it. You know, like it's a combination of all these things. Yes.
Sorry, one question. I don't know if this is going to divert a little, but what about in the cases, I don't know the specific person's name, where they decide to transition to one sex and then decide to transition back, and then they like flip flop between the two sexes. What is like the opinion or the mindset there?
So you're talking about detransitioners, or what these people are usually called.
I remember reading an article where the person had decades ago transitioned to become a woman, and then decided later that they were actually a man, and then again decided that they were a woman. And there, I guess myself don't understand like the why behind the pain and like the stress of it all.
So detransitioners, this is another like big like political like wildfire, but it's, I mean, there are documented cases like people really do transition and detransition. The prevalence of it is overstated, but if you look at the detransitioners, what tends to be the case is that they detransition due to obstacles, not because of personal feelings that actually, oh, just kidding, I'm not transgender, but because of either social obstacles, like they've just like lost their family and shit and they just can't take it, or because they're not able to get the results they want. They're just not able, it's become a social obstacle, it's interfering with their ability to get employment. It is a financial burden, it's a medical burden, which is why a lot of times people who detransition will later retransition or end up identifying non-binary or something, because a lot of the motivation, much of the time, to detransition is not feeling of, oops, I made a mistake in terms of doing what is good for me. It's about being trans is too much of a, it presents too much of a difficulty to me and my ability to live in society. Like that tends to be the big motivation for detransition. So sometimes people, or a lot of times opponents of transgender people or transitioning, will hold up these detransitioning people as being like evidence of like, oh, look at all these people who regret it. Like, we shouldn't really be allowing people to do this because it's just a kind of frivolous decision that everyone feels bad about later. That's not really the picture that is there if you look at the reality of the stories of a lot of detransitioners, which includes a few people who may just not have understood themselves correctly and transitioned sort of erroneously. But I think the more common story is that people, being trans is just too much of an obstacle for them. I know other people, for instance, who can't transition as a result of medical complications of the hormones themselves. Like I know like some people with like, I think like Crohn's disease or like, susceptibility to blood clots and things can't take male to female hormones. And some of those people will transition without hormones, but some of them will just decide like, I'm just like stuck with gender dysphoria. Like, and that's like a horrible situation, but
Isn't there a third option there too? Like, it doesn't necessarily have to be like, oops, I made a mistake, or, oh crap, this is too hard because there's political stress or body stress. Like, couldn't it just be like, there's a decade that you are female, and there's another decade that you're male, and then there's another decade that you're like, I don't think that is problematic.
I can see it happening. I mean, I'm not going to say that's like not possible. Like probably there's a person out there like that, although it's not a very common story. But I mean, I know there are people who identify as gender fluid. That tends to be, and that as an identity tends to be more like back and forth on a like weekly or daily basis, and it tends to involve more about presentation than medical transition. I don't know if anyone off the top of my head who feels that like, oh, I was a man this decade, then a woman the next decade, then back to being a man. Like that doesn't seem to be very common.
I think that Max. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Sorry. I think that Maximus, that case is sort of the case that if I were a right-wing news source, I would really want to hold that up and say, oh, these people are just wanting to waste our tax money by now they're male and now they're female. What is this? This is garbage. You know, like I don't know how often that really happens.
A frivolous extravagance. But in most cases it doesn't follow a pattern like that. Like in most cases, people transition and then that's it. Like no more transitioning. But of course, you know, this stuff is complicated, and there are going to be people who will detransition, or who there's a few people who just for whatever reason are not happy with their life as the gender they post-transition, so they'll detransition, but it's not the norm.
Or also it's just like it's fucking hard to be trans, right? I mean, it's like depending. I mean, it depends on what. Sorry.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
Like it depends on your societal context, right? Like it depends on where and when you're at, but it's not easy.
Yeah, exactly. So that is the most common case of detransitioners, is that simply obstacles external to any kind of like internal struggle about being trans are usually the motivation to detransition.
Well, so we should probably wrap up soon. There's one more question that I wanted to ask you, which is that one of the things that has struck me about this conversation, the things that you've been saying, is like, I think, you know, as an academically minded person, I have a tendency to put on some sort of, you know, theory hat and try to think about humanity or these social things, and like you have made a consistent push towards repersonalizing the way that we think about this, you know, or like frequently in your videos, you emphasize that the important question is like, how do you feel inside, whatever that means. And it's been a really refreshing perspective, and not one that comes really organically to me. And I'm wondering what, you know, because you make all these videos and they're academic, like you are advancing a thesis about a concept of one form or another, but they're also deeply personal. So I'm wondering how you bridge that gap and your thoughts about discourse in that way.
Yeah, I think that for me, I know a lot of people have difficulty imagining the transgender experience in particular is hard to imagine for people who don't have it. You're just like, what does it mean to feel like a different gender? Like, it's just hard to like get inside that mind space if it's not a mind space that's by nature recognizable to you. So one thing that I think is helpful in terms of adding to people's understanding is not just throw out a bunch of jargon about transgender and cisgender and gender dysphoria and gender identity and feeling like you're in the wrong body and all this kind of stuff, but to try to like show, don't tell. Look at a particular trans person. Here's the kinds of feelings I have. Here's how I feel about this part of my body. This is how this has affected my life. This is what, you know, and try to really like literary way, like show what these things do to me personally and what it's like for me personally, with the hope, I mean, part of it's just like expressing myself or whatever, but part of it is also like that I hope that people see me showing them my particular story, and they, you know, it's much easier to sympathize with one person than it is with a million people, right? Like when you see how it affects a single person, you can sympathize with them, or you can empathize with them, or you can sort of connect to the experience they must be having. And I think that adds an element of understanding that is absent from just reading about it in the abstract. So, I mean, I know a lot of people, like there are people in my life who are like, they say like they just didn't get the trans thing at all until I came out as trans and started transitioning. And then just through interacting with me, it totally like changed their views of it. And I think sort of part of what I'm trying to do by putting so much of personal content out is to try to give more people that experience just through watching my videos to the greatest extent possible. So that's the goal of doing that. The limitation of it, of course, is that I am not all trans people, and there's a huge variety of different experiences. You know, I'm of course not a trans man. That's going to be very different. A non-binary person is going to be very different. There's all kinds of intersections of race and class and nationality and culture and things that are going to change how your experience goes and what it means to you. So I encourage people, you know, if my videos are for anyone an introduction to the topic, I'm really flattered that I could be that. But I also hope that people also look out into the world and try to learn things about trans people who are not just like grad school white people.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Grad school white people. Yeah.
So on that note, I guess any final questions or thoughts?
Well, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for hosting this and answering our questions with such fluidity and adeptness and whatnot. And yeah, and we'll be what typically happens or what definitely happens is that we now go and make videos, right? That's the way that this class is structured, is that there's this pedagogic idea that the best way to learn about something is by speaking about it and teaching it. So we're going to all now go and make our respective videos about the ideas that you have given us, and I'll be sure to send over links. And I guess anybody still watching on the live stream, you can check out the videos will be posted on the EVO Seminar Series channel. So yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all so much for doing this. This was really cool for me. I think it worked out well. I'd be happy to do something like this again. And thanks to everyone who tuned in just to watch the stream. Hope you enjoyed it, and it's nice talking to you. Okay.